Group 2 is presenting the handling of the racial issues at the University of Missouri in 2015. While more than 80 universities faced racial protests in 2015, only a handful, such as the University of Missouri, reached crisis levels and national attention. This presentation will discuss the communication factors that resulted in this national focus and the ultimate resignation of the president and chancellor of the university. These are the topics we'll be covering in today's presentation. This is Debbie, and I'll be starting us off with an introduction to the University of Missouri, along with an overview of the timeline of the crisis events. The University of Missouri is also known affectionately as Mizzou. Interestingly, its focus is so strongly on being a research institution that its mission says quite a bit about the university's research commitment to the state of Missouri, and far less about its commitment to the education of the students. The University of Missouri consists of 4 campuses. The main campus is located in Columbia, Missouri. There are also campuses in Kansas City, Missouri, and a science and technology campus in Rolla, Missouri. Interesting for this presentation, the St. Louis campus is actually less than 2 miles from the center of Ferguson. The Mizzou total enrollment in 2020 was over 31,000 students. 83% are full-time. The overwhelming majority of both the students and faculty are white. Black students and black faculty are both the next most populous group at only 6.6% each. Unsurprisingly, the events that caused the 2015 crisis at the University of Missouri began well before 2014. But in 2014, unarmed black teenager Michael Brown was shot and killed by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. This incident caused numerous protests around the country and on over 80 U.S. college campuses. These protests resulted in counter-protests spawning additional racist incidents around the country. Initially, Chancellor Lofton held listening sessions for black students to express their feelings and frustrations. They listed numerous incidents and requested changes to campus policy to better educate students and faculty on anti-racist policies and to more strongly address racist actions on campus. But little was done by the administration between December 2014 and October 2015. In September and October 2015, racist incidents on campus increased, which aggravated the black students on campus because they felt their concerns were falling on deaf ears. The campus created a new requirement on October 8th for diversity and inclusion training. On October 10th, student protesters blocked the president's car during the school's homecoming parade. The president remained in his car, revved the engine, and bumped one of the student protesters with the car. After that incident, a count of the number of days of President Wolf's silence on the issue was posted to Twitter. 10 days later, on October 20th, a newly created black student organization called Concerned Student 1950 demanded the president's removal from office. The organization was named after the year in which black students were first admitted to the University of Missouri. After 16 days of silence from President Wolf following the homecoming incident, he finally met with students. On November 2nd, graduate student Michael Butler began a hunger strike until President Wolf was removed from office. He set himself up in the university's quad. Rapidly, other students joined him on the quad, camping out in tents. There were approximately 100 students camping on the quad with Mr. Butler. On November 6th, President Wolf apologized and referred to the school's systemic oppression. Later that evening, a student asked the president if he knew what systemic oppression was. He said, "Systemic oppression is because you don't believe you have the equal opportunity for success." The video of this response was posted to Twitter. On November 8th, the black football players announced they would not practice or play until President Wolf was removed from office. The next day, both the president and chancellor separately resigned. Next, we have Amanda with an analysis of the stakeholders in this crisis.
Hello, everyone. Amanda here. I will be discussing stakeholders and the roles that they held. The crisis of 2015 of the protests on campus was very complex and messy. The process of the communication, the roles that existed, and then the roles during the crisis were extremely unclear. So I was able to find many articles, and through the research, I found that the main issue around communicating and planning was simply that it wasn't handled well at all. And instead of the top administrators leading the campus community through the crisis, they were a lot of the reason the crisis was actually happening. And so what I found is the main issue was that the president, the chancellor, and several of the deans who would have worked on what the crisis management plan looked like could not get together and work effectively because they did not get along in general, and that there were issues that many of the deans wanted the president to fire the chancellor based off of previous situations that occurred. And instead of crafting a strategy to promote diversity and inclusion at the university and ensuring that there was a response to the protests that could then be shared widely, the president and the chancellor were not doing that. So the leadership team responded very slowly and inadequately to all of the crises that were occurring when the students were protesting and demanding justice. So this led to both internal tensions and then external attacks on the university. So emails were mentioned as the main line of communication throughout the crisis in several articles that I read, but we also know that there were honestly very limited efforts for the president at the time, Tim Wolf, to gain information about what was happening on campus and in the local community. And sometimes he went as far to refuse information when it was offered. So that doesn't really set up the crisis communication team, or it does not set up a successful situation for them. So through the articles that I read, I was able to work out a list of stakeholders, and while some began to emerge as true team members to help inform the community on campus and off campus, many roles were honestly just not clear. So I kind of separated this slide into who had a role and then who was impacted or had a role within this crisis as what they were trying to do to help solve the crisis. So the president and the chancellor, they both should have been the ones coordinating a team, working on a response and plan around the protests that were happening. The deans, they would have been on the team to assist with the response and planning. So staff, students, and faculty were not mentioned as any formal role, but we know that during the crisis, staff, students, and faculty, and even the athletic department, for example, their impact caused them to help inform others or taking actions to try to stop the crisis from continuing. So some of the student groups included the student government, and then we also had a group called Concerned Student 1950. And so these groups were actively trying to work with the administration in order to basically address the situation, but a lot of it was through demands, and the top administrators were not interested in meeting any of those demands. So the media, parents, local community, government relations, and representatives, elected officials were all in the articles, all mentioned. And then I added alum and donors because I sincerely started to think about just who's impacted, because these roles are not clearly managed or marked in any way at the time. Overall, their strategic communications and marketing office were not really able to effectively help anything because the top was not helping either. So very, very interesting.
Next, we have Joey with the types of communication that went out.
On September 12, 2015, Missouri student president Peyton Head made a Facebook post that ultimately went viral. In his post, Head described a racial slur that was made about him and a friend as they were walking around Mizzou's campus. 4 days later, on September 16, a response was issued by Chancellor Lofton, which read, "Hate has no place on Mizzou's campus." The tweet had a link that asked the campus community and joining them to stand against acts of bias and discrimination. On September 25th, Chancellor Lofton posted another tweet stating another incident of racism and hate on Mizzou campus was directed at a student with the hashtag #STOP. On October 5th, Chancellor Lofton tweeted 3 times and issued a weekly update. The first tweet indicated that on the previous night, that another act of racism and hate occurred on Traditions Plaza, which was built to celebrate the oneness of the Mizzou campus. In the second tweet, Chancellor Lofton noted racism is clearly alive at Mizzou. What we have done is not enough. Every member of our community must help us change our culture. In his final tweet on October 5th, Chancellor Lofton highlighted a statement related to the previous night's occurrence at Traditions Plaza. The weekly update also made mention of the racist and hate-filled situation that took place on Mizzou's campus. After an announcement of mandatory diversity training for all freshmen, another incident compounded the crisis. The first incident occurred on October 10th when protesters blocked the president's car during a homecoming parade where the president did not exit the vehicle to speak with the protesters. With no response from the president for more than 10 days, on October 20th, Concerned Student 1950 issued a demand of President Wolf's resignation. President Wolf met with members of Concerned Student 1950 but did not agree to their demands, and by November 2nd, a student began a hunger strike until President Wolf resigned. On November 2nd, 2015, in a weekly update, Chancellor Lofton mentioned what the university was doing or had done to address racism issues. The update also encouraged the campus community to attend Black Culture Awareness Week events. November 3rd, Chancellor Lofton and President Wolf made separate statements. Loft tweeted #Mizzou Hunger Strike, concern for well-being of #Concerned Student 1950. In President Wolf's statement, he said, "I am especially concerned about the health and safety of Missouri University student Jonathan Butler. Jonathan is a valued and effective voice in our struggle to combat racial injustice." And on November 6, 2015, President Wolf released another statement referring to a meeting with Butler, his concern about his well-being, and valuing his activism. The crisis peaked in early November with an announcement of a boycott of all football-related activities by a group of student athletes. On November 6, 2015, President Wolf was asked to define systemic oppression, where he responded with, "You," referring to Black students, "don't believe that you have the equal opportunity for success." At that same event, he said, "I will give you an answer, and I'm sure it will be a wrong answer." On November 8th, President Wolf issued another statement, which was an attempt to mitigate the ongoing racial crisis. On November 9th, 2015, President Wolf announced his resignation as president of the University of Missouri System. In his statement, he mentioned that the decision to resign came from love and that he thought hard about his decision, and he felt that it was the right thing to do. He also stated that his resignation will bring joy to some and anger to others.
And next we have Sherry with the goals of communication and specifically SCCT.
I will be talking about the relevant aspects of the situational crisis communication theory per the University of Missouri and the race-related incidents of 2015. The first thing that was clear to me in my research was that the leadership at the University of Missouri missed opportunities to effectively use the SCCT. Since we do know that the SCCT is a tool to manage reputational threat, in doing so, the stakeholders and how they will respond to the crisis-related incidents in the crisis communication is key to utilizing this tool. Coombs does point out that the very first priority, however, in any crisis is to protect the stakeholders from harm, not to protect the reputation. But in protecting stakeholders, ultimately, hopefully, you will also be protecting the reputation of the organization. So stakeholders want to know who is responsible for the crisis at hand, and this is how the attribution theory comes into play and is referenced as part of the SCCT. So history comes into play as far as how this organization has handled similar or other crises of this nature in the past. And their ability to do so moving forward is definitely a part of how their response will be perceived. There are definitely framing effects to consider, as part of the SCCT and how messaging goes out. There is one in particular that I do want to mention from 2015 when Wolf was at a fundraising event on November 7th, and a group of protesters asked him to define systemic oppression, and he responded in this way: "I will give you an answer, and I'm sure it will be the wrong answer. Systemic oppression is because you don't believe that you have the equal opportunity for success." This is from the Fortunato et al. Article. And so just the way that he framed his messaging can definitely play into how stakeholders might respond to that particular message. Concerns about prior relational reputation is something also to consider. And in this case, things that were happening in the region and in the country should have been factored into how messaging should have played out. For example, the Ferguson, Missouri event had just happened the previous year, and many of things that might have been occurring from that event and played out since that event had occurred should definitely have been factored into how responses should have been conveyed to all of the stakeholders. Since these incidents do fall into the preventable cluster, they did require serious and a significant and timely response, which we know in this case was not necessarily how things played out. It is also important to note that when image restoration theory is utilized and some of the strategies that I will outline in the next couple of slides are used, they can have negative implications if accountability is lacking. So the next couple slides outline just some of the different image repair strategies that are a part of the situational crisis communication theory were employed, and we would likely argue that they were not as effective as they could have been if the situation had been managed in a better way. So that just gives you a brief overview of some of the components of the situational crisis communication theory and image repair strategies that kind of outline and help evaluate how the messaging and the crisis communication played out at the University of Missouri. Thank you.
Next, we have Visti with the effectiveness of the communication.
In my opinion, University of Missouri officials were not at all proactive in their approach to speak with the affected student population to understand their grievances and racial issues that had occurred on campus. The actions that did take later were too little and too late when the damage to the school's reputation and prestige had already occurred. The repeated late responses to the affected student group made them feel that the management didn't care for them and that they didn't matter on campus. Even though the Black student percentage on campus in 2015 was only 7% of the total population of 35,000 students, they perceived themselves as being a part of the school and needed to be treated equally. The school officials only took notice of the unrest and disharmony on campus when the college football team decided to not participate in any sports activities. The school officials were afraid that they would lose the income generated by playing sports in the Big Ten Conference, as well as this would tarnish the image of the school in the country. The blame for the delay in engaging with the affected student population fell upon the president of the university, who was not keen in resolving the situation initially and tried to push the issue under the carpet several times, hoping that it would blow away. This infuriated the affected student population as they felt marginalized and left out. The affected students tried to use different attention-grabbing tactics to get them noticed by the president by stopping his car from entering the homecomings parade, but the president didn't come out of the car and engage with the group. Police had to intervene and remove the students from the parade. The president met with the concerned group of students a few times, but refused to acknowledge that there were any systemic racism or sexism issues on campus. This caused the boycott of the university's dining and retail services on campus.
And finally, we have Leslie with the lessons learned.
When you have people on your campus who are disrespectful or rude or make fun of people or harass individuals who, because of their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, their disability, or even their religion, it is up to leadership to hold these people accountable and direct and illustrate inappropriate and disrespectful remarks, and let the community know that these perpetrators will be held accountable and this will not be tolerated within the organization or the institution. An organization or leadership that has a crisis plan manager that maps out different types of crisis that could happen on that institution or that organization, because a crisis is something that just pops up. It just happens. And so if you look at your particular institution to see what could happen, like at the University of Missouri, that there could be racial protests or riots, this should have been on one of the maps so that the communication could have been quickly disseminated to the community to mitigate what was happening. And then you have the system president, Tim Wolf, made very limited efforts to gain information about what was happening on the campus, sometimes going so far as to refuse information that was even offered, or even just not being willing to really get help because he wasn't good at communicating and he didn't even get help to try to help mitigate the situation within the campus. So then you have leadership who are not getting along, not able to work together. That's not good because you need to be on the same page. It goes to the missions and the values and the goals of the university. And if everybody isn't on the same page and you don't like each other, then you're not going to be able to solve problems or situations or crises in a timely manner that will not harm your institution's reputation or your institution, your students, or your faculty, physical or mental status for the community. So the crisis that happened at Missouri, it was a preventable crisis, because if leadership had have taken into account the first protest when he was stopped at the car and listened to the students and their discern about what was going on, there were threats and nothing was done. Mr. Wolf didn't show that he even cared about the well-being of anybody, the students or faculty, by not listening. Again, he probably should have formed a team that would have had a plan that could have helped him communicate and help these students at the Missouri University. So the failure not having a communication plan or a communication manager, not getting along with other leadership and administration, it led to the resignation of the chancellor and the president. This was also, wanted by the students because the students of color felt as though that they weren't heard, and this, made them angry. So it ruined the reputation of the university. There was no plan to have a first communication showing some support for the students of color. It got out of hand. Then the university was being threatened. Faculty were afraid to teach. And then, it takes years to get your reputation back. So there was a lessons learned from the university where people now in 2018 went to look at the University of Missouri at Columbia, and they were like, wow, it looks really great here. The upheaval didn't happen where they at the campus that this family was looking at. So it is important. Lessons learned is to have a communications plan, hold people accountable, make sure that you are following the missions and goals and values of the university, and that your leadership is aligned together with the missions and the goals and the values of the institution and or organization, to make sure that the crisis communication comes out in a timely manner and it shows the individuals, the audience, that this affects that you care.
And that concludes Group 2's presentation on the racial communications crisis on the University of Missouri campus in 2015. Here are our references, and we look forward to answering your questions during our discussion.